And you talk about metacognition and mindfulness. I know mindfulness is a big deal between Matt and myself. But you say that mindfulness doesn't go like what we kind of see mindfulness, or kind of the popular conception of mindfulness, doesn't take it far enough. Can you explain that to me? Because if we're going to, as you put it, we're going to have to, before we rewire it, we're going to have to get outside and look down and see how it's all having that self-awareness, and mindfulness is a way that to get there, right? But you say they don't, the present way that it's talked about, it doesn't go far enough. So explain that to me.
Yeah, it just seems that most of the literature on mindfulness talks about mindfulness for the sake of mindfulness, essentially. Like develop that awareness of what's going on in your mind, and then you're done. Do it some more, right? They don't often go the step further that I think is really important. And I have to wonder if people are, meditating and developing this metacognitive awareness, this awareness of what's going on in their own mind, and then they don't instinctively know to take it a step further and to actually engage in psychitecture, right? So, I kind of, almost intuitively, when I should have been paying more attention to like the physical world around me or the social interactions or whatever, I have a inclination to pay attention to what's going on in my own mind, right? I feel like most people don't. Most people have to have, a really regular practice to sort of turn off this monkey mind and actually observe what's going on in there. But once you do that, there's this whole world of, kind of changing those responses, not just awareness of what's going on, but the ability to then step back and say, okay, I can see that I'm having this response. I can see that every time my coworker makes this comment to me, that I go into this whole, emotional spiral, right? But now I have to ask, what are the leverage points? How can I actually jump in and change it so I don't have that reaction anymore, right? So yes, mindfulness and metacognition are essential prerequisites to this whole world of psychitecture, but you can go further and actually start changing these things.
Yeah, I love that, how mindfulness, the point of it is to weaken the shield around the algorithm, right? That's, to me, that was kind of the aha moment for me. It's like, oh, okay, so yeah, I think I'm with you on that. I think I was in the camp of like, okay, I get mindfulness so I can be this at peace all the time, and that I can always have this kind of calm demeanor about it. But you take it a step further and saying, well, that's all good and well, but let's use it so that we can find the weak areas in the algorithm, so I can start diving in and rewiring, right?
Right, exactly.
But one thing I found interesting in the book was you made this distinction between sort of Eastern and Western approaches to spiritual life, if you like, and this focus, particularly with the Stoics, on development of ego versus perhaps, a desire to let go of ego from an Eastern perspective. Yeah, could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there is kind of what I think of as kind of a cultural dogma today, where we've all sort of accepted, at least those who are into the sort of spirituality, self-help space, that the ego is our enemy, that the ego is a bad thing, and that the goal of spiritual growth and happiness is essentially to quash it, to get rid of our ego so we're no longer thinking about ourselves. Well, if this sort of theory that I lay out in this book is right, and there is a self-appraisal system in our brains that's sort of running the show and regulating our well-being, you really ideally wouldn't want to eliminate your ego. You wouldn't want to eliminate your own sense of self, because that's what's generating that eudaimonia, right? That's what the ancients kind of said, is you behave virtuously so as to improve your own view of yourself in an accurate way. I mean, not just artificially inflating your view of yourself, but really becoming that person that you admire. That's the deepest kind of happiness you can get. And so I think by trying to eliminate your ego, you're both eliminating one of the greatest sources of suffering, yes, because a lot of people who are miserable, hate themselves, and they can't stop thinking about how they don't approve of themselves. So yes, you're not going to hit the lowest low if you eliminate your ego, but you're not going to hit the highest high either. You're sort of taking the batteries out of the happiness unhappiness machine in your brain. And so yeah, I think the whole spiritual enlightenment ego transcendence thing would be a relief. It would feel like bliss to someone who had been in a really depressive state. And I think that's what we see in people like Eckhart Tolle, who, have written books about how, he was depressed and he hated himself. And then one day he just had this enlightenment experience where he no longer had a self, and it was bliss. And he just sat on park benches and listened to birds chirp. And I think it would feel like that if you were really depressed and really disliked yourself. But I also think, today there's a very good chance that Eckhart Tolle, has a very positive identity and does have a sense of self, because he's become, someone he's proud of. He's become this guru, this thinker that, is best-selling author. People come, travel throughout the world to hear what he has to say. And so I think this is probably explains the experience of a lot of gurus. They go from, you might say, -1 to 0 to 1 on a scale of happiness, and that 0 is essentially the ego transcendence. It's better than negative, but it's not as good as it can be. And so that's why I think, maybe mindfulness can be used as a tool. Maybe you can go through periods where you step away from your ego, but ultimately you do it to design a better ego. You do it so you can step back in to a strong positive sense of self instead of just no sense of self.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting. And does that map on to the idea of spiritual bypass?
Explain spiritual bypass for me.
Well, so I mean, spiritual bypass is effectively using spiritual techniques to avoid oneself, right? To avoid the ego, to avoid negative, and so on, without necessarily developing ourselves or engaging in our emotional bodies and so on. And I first heard the term. It was used by a therapist a long time ago. She was very much a specialist in trauma release work, and she dealt with a monk who said he'd spent 20 years meditating in a monastery, but finally realized he actually come back down to earth and do some work on his childhood. And he'd been in a sort of semi-permanent state of spiritual bypass.
Yeah, I think it sounds like that absolutely maps onto it. I think that's part of what the outcome would be if you really practiced spirituality diligently with the goal of, enlightenment. I think you would be avoiding in some ways your own virtues, your own values, your own approval of yourself. And so I think it's important to, maybe use it as a temporary tool, but ultimately always come back. I like to sometimes think of it as like, imagine you're creating a painting. You're trying to create the most beautiful painting you can, but you're right up close to it. You can't get a full view of it. So you need to take a step back away from the canvas and kind of look at it from a distance so you can come back in and do it better. But a lot of people, they take a step back and they take another step back, and they think the goal is to just keep stepping back till they leave the continent, right? So ultimately, you want to go back in and build that better self.
Back on the horizon, right?
Exactly. And so there's a lot of people who have argued that you should quiet your default mode network. You should limit your sense of self, transcend your ego completely. And while I think this would be a much better approach than, to remain in a state where you don't approve of yourself and you do have this self-critical monologue, I think it's better than either of those to redesign your ego, to build a better ego that's based in reality and become a person that you do approve of, so that your default mode network likes you instead of hating you.
Yeah. No, this is something that I've thought about before too. And it's like a lot of people say that the goal of meditation is to kind of become nothing.
Yeah.
But I think it's more than that. It's becoming nothing and then becoming something else, right? Like becoming a higher version of yourself.
Yeah, I have an interesting relationship with meditation and mindfulness and all that because, from a really early age, I was very interested in my own mind. I was very interested in observing my own thoughts and emotions, and even going in and trying to change them and saying like, oh, can I, make myself feel this emotion when this happens instead of the negative one. And so this was kind of my fascination as I was kind of a teenager, and other people were paying attention to the world around them. I was paying attention to the world inside me. And so,
Right, yeah.
yeah. And so in many ways, I think I was doing something similar to meditating from that early age. When I got a little older and I started hearing all about mindfulness and meditation, I was like, oh, this is right up my alley. I need to try this. And I started, when I was in college, I meditated every day for a year. Not like for an insane long amount of time, but like 10, 15 minutes a day. And there were some benefits that definitely came along with it. I think I was less invested in myself. I think I was, better able to focus on things that were not that interesting to me. But overall, I sort of came to the conclusion that I'm naturally kind of like someone who has a meditative practice that I don't even try to do, that's more cognitive introspection. And I sort of get my meditation exercise through that. It's almost like running on the treadmill versus playing tennis. It's like, running on the treadmill clearly is a good activity to do that will get you in shape. Playing tennis is just a really fun thing that you can take as sort of a path to mastery, and you'll get in shape through the process without making it a deliberate practice. That being said, I've realized that a lot of people don't have this metacognitive awareness, and they really don't know what's going on inside their own head, and they really do just accept their thoughts as reality immediately. And that's why I've made mindfulness and meditation kind of a prerequisite in all of my books. Everything I've created, I generally start out by telling people, you should probably be meditating. You should be observing your thoughts and trying to get better at knowing what's going on in your head, because if you don't know what's going on up there, you can't actually change it. You got no shot.
There's similar to what you said. So I think Alan Watts said this, that if you are thinking all the time, then you have nothing to think about than thoughts.
Right. Yeah, it's true. That's the role that metacognition plays, of stepping back and thinking about the thoughts and observing the thoughts. And Alan Watts he's one of my favorite thinkers, teachers. I love everything he's done. And it's interesting that he has a book called Become What You Are, and I'm coming out with this book called Become Who You Are. And there is some interesting interactions between those ideas. I don't necessarily accept some of the ideas that are very common in Buddhism and Taoism and that kind of thing, that we shouldn't have a sense of self, that we should transcend our ego entirely. One of the arguments I make in this book is that the ego, or the self, it can cause us a lot of suffering, right? But it can also produce the greatest, deepest happiness when we become a self that we're truly proud of. And so instead of trying to disable that self, I encourage people to work on it and enhance it and build it up to the point where you can honestly say you're proud of that self and you're happy to get to be a self that you love every day.